Hello, this is the first presentation for Biology of Plants at Arkansas State University, Campus Querétaro. And today we will be talking about plants' transition from water to land, and I will be giving an introduction to the bryophytes. So, we mentioned this before already, but essentially the closest relatives of plants, of modern plants, are going to be Carophycean green algae. That is, algae that actually lived in water. So the earliest plant fossils actually suggest that this transition happened around 490 million years ago. And the characteristics of algae are quite different from those of modern plants, mainly in that modern plants have a lot of adaptations that allow for the survival on land. Therefore, the process of moving onto land had to do with the gaining of all those adaptations that will allow the plants to survive in land. And the driver of that, we believe, had to do with the lack of competition on land. This new environment outside of the water was going to, there wasn't going to be anyone up there. And therefore there was going to be abundant sunlight and new environments for the plants to live in. We believe that therefore the process of natural selection was driving that exit of plants and the development of those adaptations that will allow for survival on land. And populations over time evolved to have features that allowed for that. So here we can look at the evolutionary tree of plants. And here specifically we're looking at how the evolutionary process occurred. Originally, we believe that the common ancestor for plants was a green alga. And then eventually we have a first offshoot of that lineage that's going to be the non-vascular plants, also called the bryophytes. And that group is going to include three subgroups: mosses, liverworts, and hornworts, which we will be covering in more detail later. There was later further diversification that eventually resulted in the production of vascular plants, earlier vascular plants that look like ferns, and later further on in plants such as conifers and flowering plants. But first, we need to look at that first offshoot that came out. So, to be able to live on land, plants have to generate those adaptations that I mentioned before. And we can divide those adaptations into vegetative and reproductive adaptations. Reproductive adaptations have to do with the production of gametes. As you know, in animals we have sperm and eggs that are going to be typical gametes. And in these plants we also have sperm and eggs as the gametes, but also adaptations that have to do with the production of spores. On the other hand, we also have vegetative adaptations that have to do with the overall body of the plant, excluding the reproductive structures. So, reproductive adaptations, including having thick spore walls to protect reproductive spores from drying out. So, plants such as mosses produce spores, and the spores, as you can see here, have rather thick cell walls that are going to be protective and are going to prevent those spores from dying from lack of moisture. There was also the production of tissues called gametangia that would surround and protect gametes. Gametes in this case, again, we're talking about eggs and sperm. And the main reason they needed to be protected is because previously they were adapted to living in a very moist environment inside the water, and now they could dry out if there was no further protection. So we can see over here in an alga, you have a tissue that is producing gametes, in this case sperm, and it's basically just a sac. But in early plants, you have much thicker layers of tissue that are going to be surrounding that the developing gametes, so that they do not dry out and die before they're ready to be released. Another adaptation is also special maternal structures that are going to be protecting the embryos. Again, the embryo is going to be the new organism produced after fertilization, and those also can die from desiccation. So the tissues of the mother plant are going to be protecting that. Now, talking about vegetative adaptations, we have a few. We can start with vascular tissues to transport water throughout the plant. Since the plants were no longer submerged in water, they needed to move water inside their bodies. So, for example, here we can see xylem. That was one of the later adaptations that appeared as vascular tissue. Eventually, plants also developed a waxy cuticle to prevent plant tissues from drying out, and we've talked about cuticle quite a few times as that protective covering in the outside of plants that is going to be made of lipids that don't allow water to leave the body of the plant. And there was also the production of stomata. You're already familiar with stomata, and as you know, stomata are going to be allowing the plant to exchange gases or to close up to prevent water loss. And furthermore, stomata work together with vascular tissues to move water throughout the body of the plant in the xylem. So they're also a very important adaptation for living on land. A little bit more about vegetative adaptations. We also have the formation of a symbiotic association with soil fungi that we know as mycorrhizae, that we've covered before. And basically, as you know, that is going to be allowing plants to acquire water and minerals from the soil in ways that the plant alone would not be able to do. And there was also the development of protective pigments that can help block ultraviolet radiation. Plants living inside the water are protected from ultraviolet radiation basically because water filters most of that radiation out. But once the plants are out, too much of that UV radiation can be deadly, can be destructive to the DNA of plants, and so having those accessory pigments that we've also covered before is going to be an adaptation to living on land. So now we can look at the origin of plants, right? This is another representation of that evolutionary tree, that phylogenetic tree of plants. And all plants together, we also call them as a clade, as a phylogenetic group, embryophytes. And we know from molecular evidence that plants are all descended from a single common ancestor, meaning that all of the tree connects at that one point in the distant past. And we know that the first plants that colonized land were very similar to the bryophytes that we will be talking about in the next few presentations. Those plants that sort of retained many of the primitive characteristics, or the ancestral characteristics, I should say instead, right? And then after those appear, we know that there's also further adaptations that give us vascular plants and gymnosperms and flowering plants and so on. But first we have to start with the very earliest plants that resemble bryophytes. And so when we talk about bryophytes, we're talking about non-vascular plants. Bryophytes are going to be small plants that typically grow in moist areas. They are still very much dependent on water for their survival, so they live in places where water is available at least most of the year. And they are organized into 3 phyla. Those are hornworts, liverworts, and mosses. Mosses are going to be the ones that you're probably most familiar with, and they look kind of like this. Liverworts, we will also be covering very soon, are these ones, and these are hornworts. So, a few characteristics of the bryophytes. As you might remember, there are 2 stages in the life cycle of plants because they have alternation of generations. So they're going to have a gametophyte generation and a sporophyte generation. The gametophyte produces gametes and the sporophyte produces spores. So in bryophytes, the gametophyte generation is the dominant one, meaning that it is the one that is doing photosynthesis and that has most of the biomass of the organism. Gametophytes are always nutritionally independent of the sporophytes, meaning that they make their own food. And in fact, it's the sporophytes that are dependent on the gametophyte for nutrients and for sugars in order for them to survive, at least for part of their life cycle. So, for example, here we have a moss gametophyte, which is going to be the green portion, and we have sporophytes coming out. And the sporophytes are connected to the gametophyte, and they need to be connected to it in order to survive. Other important characteristic of bryophytes is that they require water for their reproduction, and that is because they still produce sperm. Not all plants do. As you know, in other plants, the movement of gametes happens through pollen. But in this case, bryophytes are still producing sperm, and it's sperm that has flagella, meaning those long tails that allow for it to swim. So it has to swim in something, and that something is water. So you need to have water available for them to be able to swim and find the egg. In the case of bryophytes, in fact, they have two-tailed sperm. So that two-tailed sperm is able to find the egg by swimming to it. And we have special structures that are characteristic of bryophytes. There are going to be antheridia, which are the structure that produces a sperm, male gametes, and archegonia, the structure that produces eggs. And here we have an example. We have the antheridium, which is the singular for antheridia, and the archegonium in moss. And we'll be looking at them specifically for each one of the groups of bryophytes. So after fertilization, the zygote, when the sperm and the egg come together, their zygote forms, and it does so inside the archegonium, that maternal structure that is going to be protecting the new embryo. The sporophyte will in turn develop from the embryo, and it remains dependent on the gametophyte, as we said earlier. So if you learn nothing else today, you have learned that moths actually produce sperm, and they look like this. Another characteristic of bryophytes is that they are going to be releasing their spores from elevated structures called sporangia. So sporangia is essentially the structure that is producing and housing spores as they mature, and you can see them right here. You have the body of the gametophyte, and you have a structure coming out on top of it where the spores are going to be. And it makes sense that it would be a raised structure because they're going to be releasing those spores, and in most cases those are going to be carried by wind. And so it makes sense that they would have a little bit of height so that can happen more easily. There's also, as another characteristic, the fact that they are quite simple. There's not a lot of complexity to the body of the plant, and very importantly, there is no vascular tissue yet. There's no xylem and there is no phloem, and that is essentially it for our introduction to bryophytes. So, if you have any questions, please let me know. You can always post them in the discussion forum that I have set up for these presentations. And as we move on, please try to stay positive, let's stay in touch, and I will see you in the next presentation. Bye!